The rain in Seoul doesn't wash away sins, it just hides them. Han Minwoo sat in the back of his black sedan, staring at the neon lights reflecting off his manicured fingernails. He was 25, a prince in a kingdom of wolves, protected by the ironclad loyalty of his father's best friend, Seo Jin-tae. To the world, they were a united front. To Jin-tae, Minwoo was merely an obstacle to be cleared. For 10 years, Jin-tae had played the role of the devoted servant. He moved with the grace of a shadow, whispered advice into the boss's ear, and smiled with eyes that never reached his heart. He was waiting. Not for a promotion, but for a funeral. As the car door opened, a gaunt, shivering figure reached out, a homeless man who had haunted the Syndicate's steps for a decade. Minwoo reached for his wallet, prepared to toss a bill and move on. Instead, a hand like a rusted claw clamped onto his wrist. The man leaned in, the smell of rot and old tobacco hitting Minwoo like a physical blow. "Your most loyal man," the stranger wheezed, his eyes wide with genuine terror. "He wants your throne." "It's Seo Jin-tae." The incense in the memorial hall was thick, a cloying, heavy scent of sandalwood and old sins. Han Minwoo stood at the head of the long, obsidian-polished table, the air in the room vibrating with the weight of his father's absence. He was 25, wearing a suit that felt 2 sizes too heavy, his skin pale against the sharp, charcoal wool. 30 years of his father's iron rule had ended with a sudden, silent heart failure. Now, the room was filled with the vultures, the elders, the regional lieutenants, the men who had spent 3 decades fearing the name Han. They looked at Minwoo and saw a boy playing dress-up. Except for one. Seo Jin-tae stood to Minwoo's right, a step behind, just as he had stood for his father. His posture was perfect, shoulders squared, hands clasped behind his back, a mask of stoic grief etched into his lined face. Jin-tae was the mortar that held the Syndicate together. He was the one who had navigated the bloody street wars of the 90s while Minwoo was still learning to write his name. "The transition is absolute," Jin-tae said, his voice a low, steady baritone that cut through the murmuring of the elders. He didn't look at the men, he looked at the back of Minwoo's head. "My father, your late boss, entrusted this burden to his blood. I am here only to ensure the blood stays on the throne." Minwoo turned, feeling the phantom weight of his father's hand on his shoulder. He looked at Jin-tae and felt a surge of genuine, desperate gratitude. Everyone else in this room was calculating their next move, measuring their loyalty in percentages of profit. But Jin-tae was the constant. "I don't know this world the way you do, uncle," Minwoo whispered, the vulnerability slipping out before he could catch it. Jin-tae's expression softened, the corners of his eyes crinkling in a way that felt like a lifetime of protection. He reached out, his hand firm and steady as he adjusted Minwoo's lapel. It was a father's gesture, intimate and grounding. "You don't need to know the world, Minwoo," Jin-tae replied, his voice dripping with a warmth that felt like a sanctuary. "You only need to know that I am here. As long as you breathe, the Empire holds." Minwoo nodded, his chest loosening. He didn't see the way Jin-tae's thumb lingered on his pulse point for a fraction of a second too long. He didn't see the calculation in Jin-tae's eyes, the way he was already mapping out the next decade of his life. Minwoo walked toward his father's desk, ready to lead. Behind him, Jin-tae followed, his shadow long and dark, already beginning to swallow the room. The street outside the Syndicate headquarters was a narrow vein of cracked asphalt and flickering streetlights. For most, it was a place to avoid, the shadow of the building loomed over it like a gravestone. For Old Man Park, however, it was his living room. Park had been a fixture here since the days when the elder Han was still shaking down wet market vendors for protection money. He was a ghost of a man, skin like parchment paper stretched over brittle bones, wrapped in layers of filthy, oversized coats that smelled of rain and industrial grease. The city had long ago forgotten him, and in the underworld, he was as invisible as a discarded soda can. But a man who is ignored sees everything. Park sat on a milk crate tucked into the alleyway's darkest crook, his eyes constantly darting, tracking the comings and goings of the Syndicate. He knew the engines of the cars by their hum. He knew which lieutenants were skimming off the top by the nervous twitch in their hands. And, most importantly, He knew Seo Jin-tae. For 10 years, Park had watched the dance. He saw the way Jin-tae's face would transform once he stepped out of the lobby, how the mask of the loyal soldier would drop, revealing a cold, predatory hunger that made the air around him seem to grow thin. He saw the specific, obsessive pattern of the Wednesday nights. He watched Jin-tae vanish into the city, only to reappear hours later, looking refreshed, looking ready. Park's mind was fractured, cluttered with the debris of a life spent on the fringes, but he possessed a terrifying clarity regarding the power dynamics of the building. He saw the young heir, Min-woo, exit the car with the arrogance of a boy who believed he was safe because his father's old guard was beside him. Park felt a strange, protective urge for the boy. It wasn't kindness, it was a visceral, animal reaction to seeing a lamb trusting a wolf in sheep's clothing. He leaned against the cold brick, clutching a half-empty bottle of cheap soju to his chest, his hands trembling, not from the winter chill, but from the weight of his own secret. He had held this knowledge for years, watching the poison drip into the foundations of the empire. He had waited for the right moment, for the flash of a moment when the boy would actually look at him. Tonight, the winds shifted. The heavy, gold-trimmed doors of the headquarters swung open, and the young heir stepped out, bathed in the harsh, artificial light of the lobby. He looked tired, vulnerable, and completely unaware of the shadow standing just a few feet behind him. Park stood up, his joints popping like dry kindling. This was the moment. The silence of the street was about to be broken, and the long, slow decade of Jin-tae's patience was about to collide with a single, whispered truth. The cold night air hit Min-woo like a slap, clearing the lingering scent of funeral incense from his lungs. He was exhausted. The succession meetings had been a grueling marathon of posturing and veiled threats, and the only thing he wanted was the silence of his private residence. He walked toward his black sedan, his heels clicking sharply against the pavement. He was surrounded by the usual security detail, silent, stone-faced men who moved in perfect sync. That was when he saw him. The old man, a permanent stain on the pristine sidewalk, had shuffled forward, blocking his path. "Sir," the man rasped. The guards stepped forward instantly, their hands moving toward their holsters, but Min-woo raised a palm to stop them. "It's all right," Min-woo said, his voice weary. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick roll of cash. It was a reflex, a small, performative act of charity that he hoped would buy him a moment of peace. As Min-woo extended the money, the old man didn't reach for the bills. Instead, his hand shot out like a striking viper, clamping onto Min-woo's wrist with a strength that belied his frail appearance. The contact was electric, searing. Min-woo's guards lunged, but the old man didn't flinch. He leaned in, his breath a foul cocktail of rot and stale alcohol. "They're all looking at your shadow, boy," the man hissed, his voice trembling with a frantic, crystalline intensity. "But they're missing the viper in your own coat." Min-woo froze. The world seemed to drop away, leaving only the terrified, bloodshot eyes of the stranger. "Who?" Min-woo whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What are you talking about?" The old man's grip tightened, his fingernails digging into Min-woo's skin. He looked over his shoulder, checking the darkness, then pulled Min-woo's head down so close that their foreheads almost touched. "Seo Jin-tae," the man breathed, the name hitting the air like a curse. "He's been sharpening his blade for 10 years. You're not the heir to him. You're the carcass." The guards finally reached them, roughly wrenching the old man away. He hit the pavement hard, sprawling into the gutter, but he didn't scream. He just stared up at Min-woo with a gaze that was disturbingly, terrifyingly sane. Min-woo stood paralyzed. His wrist throbbed where the man had gripped him. He looked toward his car, where Jin-tae was standing, holding the passenger door open. The older man was watching, a faint, polite smile of confusion on his face, waiting for his young leader to finish his business with the town fool. Min-woo looked back at the old man in the gutter, then at his mentor. The world had just tilted on its axis, and for the first time, the smile he saw on Jin-tae's face didn't look like sanctuary. It looked like a trap. Min-woo's digital dragnet was cold, clinical, and exhaustive. He expected to find clandestine meetings with rival gangs or shell corporations, but the data told a different story. Every trail led to the same destination, a notorious, high-end brothel hidden in the neon-drenched belly of the red light district. A brothel? Min-woo scoffed, his voice echoing in the silence of his father's study. He dug deeper, pulling classified intelligence on the establishment. It was a sprawling, multi-level maze of velvet drapes, private alcoves, and shifting identities. It was a place of permanent transience, a sanctuary for people who wanted to disappear. Crucially, the Syndicate's own security protocols ignored such venues entirely. To them, a brothel was a place for base indulgence, not for high-level military strategy. It was a blind spot, hidden in plain sight. Min-woo watched the surveillance footage he'd hacked from a nearby traffic camera. Jin-tae would arrive at 10 p.m., wearing a nondescript coat. He never looked at the cameras. He would walk through the front entrance, past the bouncers who knew him only as a regular patron, and vanish into the labyrinthine interior. For 3 hours, Min-woo's team tracked the exterior. Nothing suspicious happened. No coded briefcases changed hands. No known enemies followed him inside. It was a hive of chaotic motion, but Jin-tae was just another shadow moving with the crowd. Min-woo leaned back, his head throbbing. He had expected to uncover a secret war room where Jin-tae plotted the downfall of the Han legacy. Instead, he found the perfect camouflage. If Jin-tae were planning a coup, he wouldn't use a secure bunker where he could be easily monitored. He would use the one place in the city where a man's presence was expected, overlooked, and utterly ignored. The logic began to gnaw at him. Was this really just a man's pathetic, lonely vice, or was the brothel the ultimate tactical choice? The noise, the constant turnover of staff, and the layers of enforced silence made it the perfect venue for an untraceable coup. Yet, as he watched Jin-tae leave at 1 a.m., looking weary and unremarkable, Min-woo felt his resolve waver. He wanted to find a monster, but he found a man whose only blemish appeared to be a secret, sordid habit. The surveillance logs on the brothel continued to yield nothing but disappointment. Min-woo sat before his bank of monitors, his eyes straining against the low-light glare of the grainy footage. On screen, Jin-tae entered the brothel with mechanical precision. Inside, Mira Kwan, a woman who lived in a guarded room upstairs, was his only designated contact. The brothel staff kept their distance. They were paid well to ignore the men who visited the upper tiers. It was the perfect ecosystem for a ghost. Min-woo watched a segment where Jin-tae emerged from a private room. He didn't look like a strategist. He looked drained. He would stop at the bar, drink a glass of ice water, and exchange a few words with a hostess before exiting into the rain. There was no evidence of a secret network, no hidden caches of weapons, and no signals passed to henchmen. The silence of the room was heavy with the weight of Min-woo's paranoia. He had been looking for a dagger, but he had found only a man's secret, pathetic ritual. The setting was so mundane that it mocked him. Why would a master tactician hide in a place filled with dancers and transient guests? It was too risky. Too common. It's just a routine, Min-woo whispered, his voice raspy with fatigue. He felt a sudden, sharp spike of self-loathing. He had allowed the ravings of a gutter-dwelling beggar to make him turn his digital gaze upon his mentor. He had turned the sacred trust of his father's legacy into a voyeuristic hunt for sins that didn't exist. If Jin-tae ever discovered he had been spied on, if he learned Min-woo had breached the sanctity of his private vices, the betrayal would not be from Jin-tae, but from the heir himself. Min-woo clicked the delete icon, purging the servers. He couldn't let anyone know he had been watching. If this reached the council, he would look weak, paranoid, and unfit for the throne. He stood up, his legs feeling heavy, and stared out at the city. The guilt was suffocating, but the relief was intoxicating. He had checked the most likely place for a conspiracy to hide, and he had come up empty. He was safe. He had double-checked, and he had found nothing but the human frailty of a man he had loved as an uncle. He turned away from the monitors, finally allowing his guard to fall. He was entirely unaware that in the world of the Syndicate, a lack of evidence in a place as chaotic as a brothel wasn't proof of innocence. It was the ultimate, calculated camouflage. The following morning, the atmosphere in the headquarters felt lighter, scrubbed clean of the phantom anxieties that had haunted Minwoo for days. The sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive suite seemed to turn the dust motes into gold, casting a veneer of peace over the sprawling criminal empire. Minwoo felt almost buoyant. He walked with a newfound confidence, his stride unburdened by the phantom weight of suspicion. When he reached the mahogany doors of the inner sanctum, he pushed them open without waiting for an announcement. Jin-tae was there, seated behind a desk that had belonged to Minwoo's father. He was reviewing a series of maritime manifests, his reading glasses perched low on his nose. When he saw Minwoo enter, he removed them with a practiced, graceful motion and offered a warm, indulgent smile. "Good morning, Minwoo," Jin-tae said, standing up. "You look like you've finally slept." Minwoo walked to the desk, the words he had rehearsed sitting heavy and honest on his tongue. "I have, uncle. And I've been doing a lot of thinking." Jin-tae tilted his head, his expression open and attentive. About? About us. About the transition, Minwoo started, his voice steadying. "I've been overwhelmed. I let my imagination get the better of me. I've been paranoid, questioning everyone, even you. It was a mistake. I see that now." Jin-tae's face remained a masterclass in controlled sympathy. He moved around the desk, his hands clasped behind his back, stopping just a few feet from the young man. "The crown is a heavy burden, Minwoo. It's natural to feel the weight. But you should never feel that you have to navigate it alone." "I know," Minwoo replied, feeling a flush of genuine shame. "I want to apologize. I've been looking for shadows where there are none. From now on, I want to lean on you more. I want to learn." Jin-tae reached out, placing a firm, fatherly hand on Minwoo's shoulder. The contact was solid, grounding, and completely devoid of malice. "That is all I have ever wanted. Your father didn't just leave you an empire, he left you a legacy of trust. I am merely the steward of that trust." Minwoo exhaled, a sound of profound relief. The tension he had been carrying for 10 days evaporated, replaced by a reckless, beautiful sense of belonging. He had come to apologize for his doubts, but in doing so, he had handed Jin-tae the only thing he had been lacking, permission to drop all pretenses. "Thank you, uncle," Minwoo whispered. Jin-tae patted his shoulder twice, his eyes soft and reassuring. "Go get some breakfast, Minwoo. We have a shipping merger to finalize this afternoon. Let's make your father proud." Minwoo turned and left the office, walking out into the hallway with his head held high. He felt lighter than air, entirely unaware that he had just signed his own death warrant. The door to the inner sanctum clicked shut, the sound muffled by the thick, velvet-lined walls of the hallway. Inside, the warmth that had crinkled the corners of Seo Jin-tae's eyes vanished instantly. He didn't move. He stood perfectly still in the center of the office, staring at the space where Minwoo had stood just seconds before. The paternal affection that had radiated from him like a furnace turned into a glacial, terrifying stillness. He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit and pulled out a sleek, burner phone, a device that had never once pinged on any of Minwoo's forensic scans. He didn't dial a number, he simply tapped the screen twice. The room remained silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. Jin-tae walked over to the desk and sat down. He smoothed out the maritime manifests Minwoo had been worried about, his movements precise, almost surgical. The paranoia Minwoo had confessed to had been a dangerous variable, a ripple in the water that could have capsized his entire decade of preparation. But now? Now the water was perfectly still again. He had waited 10 years for this specific moment of vulnerability. He sent a single, coded message: "The path is clear." He knew exactly who was on the other end. For years, he had spent his Wednesday nights not with a lover, but with the architects of his future. Mira Kwan was no lounge singer, she was the hub of an untraceable network of contractors, fixers, and specialists who lived outside the Syndicate's reach. They were the ones who carried out the tasks that required no fingerprints, no names, and no witnesses. They were the ghosts of the Underworld, and tonight, they were coming for the king. Jin-tae picked up a fountain pen and signed the final page of the merger documents. His handwriting was elegant, loops and lines perfectly balanced. He was calm, focused, and utterly devoid of hesitation. He had spent 10 years mourning his friend, the old boss, while simultaneously building a sarcophagus for the boy who had dared to take his place. He looked up at the wall, where a portrait of Han Jae-min hung. The old king looked down at him with an expression of stoic, painted judgment. "You chose the wrong successor, Jae-min," Jin-tae whispered to the canvas, his voice devoid of anger, sounding only like a man stating a simple, immutable fact. "You chose a legacy of blood, but you forgot that blood can be spilled. I chose a legacy of time." He stood up and walked to the window. The city below was beginning to light up, a sea of flickering neon. Somewhere out there, the gears he had set into motion were turning, unstoppable and silent. The throne was no longer a dream. It was an appointment. The strike didn't come with a gunshot or a scream. It didn't come from a masked assassin leaping from the shadows, nor a betrayal in a dark alley. It was, much like Jin-tae's decade of service, a masterpiece of quiet, relentless efficiency. It was 10 p.m. on a Wednesday, the hour of Jin-tae's ritual, now a ghost of a memory. Min-woo was in his private car, heading back from a late dinner with the council. The night was slick with a fresh, freezing rain that blurred the city lights into smears of neon ink. He felt at peace, the heavy burden of his earlier fears long forgotten. He looked at his driver, a man who had been with his father for 15 years, and shared a joke about the incompetence of the catering staff. The car slowed as it entered a construction zone on the outskirts of the district, a standard, unavoidable detour. The engine shuddered. Once. Twice. Then, the entire vehicle went dead. The interior lights flickered and died, leaving them in a suffocating, heavy dark. "Sir?" the driver asked, his voice calm. "I'll check the battery." The driver stepped out into the rain. Min-woo watched him walk toward the front of the sedan. The street was desolate, the construction lights having been cut. There was no sound save for the rhythmic drumming of rain on the roof. Then, the driver simply vanished. He didn't cry out. He didn't stumble. He stepped around the corner of a cement barrier and never reappeared. A cold, sharp realization pierced through Min-woo's calm. He reached for the handle of the car door, but it wouldn't budge. It was jammed, not by accident, but by a precise, mechanical modification he hadn't noticed. He leaned forward to the partition, pounding on the glass, but the interior of the car began to fill with a faint, sweet-smelling mist. It wasn't smoke. It was a pressurized, aerosolized sedative, silent and lethal. Min-woo's head began to swim. He fumbled for his phone, but the screen was dead. He looked out the window one last time. In the distance, standing under a solitary, flickering streetlight, a figure stood watching. It was Jin-tae. He wasn't holding a weapon. He wasn't running. He stood with his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed, watching the sedan with the calm, detached interest of a man observing a sunset. Min-woo's eyelids grew heavy. The terror he had feared for weeks finally arrived, but it was hollow. As the darkness pulled him under, the final image in his mind was not of the homeless man or the warnings of treason. It was the memory of Jin-tae's hand on his shoulder, the hand that had been guiding him not toward a throne, but toward an open grave. The king fell asleep, and the crown quietly slid into the mud. The rain had stopped by the time the morning sun touched the spires of the city, leaving the streets slick and glistening like polished obsidian. Inside the Syndicate's headquarters, the air was heavy with the scent of lilies and floor wax. The memorial hall was crowded, a sea of somber suits and bowed heads, all gathered for the second funeral in 10 years. Han Min-woo's casket was closed. There was no need for an open viewing. The official report cited a tragic, freak mechanical failure, a carbon monoxide leak in the vintage sedan that had rendered the young heir unconscious before he slipped away. It was a clean, sorrowful accident. The Council of Elders wept with genuine, performative grief, mourning the end of the Han bloodline. Seo Jin-tae stood at the podium. He wore a suit of charcoal silk, his face a perfect mirror of loss. He spoke of Minwoo's potential, of his kindness, and of the tragedy of a life cut short before it could truly bloom. His voice was steady, resonant, and touched with just the right amount of trembling regret. In the back of the room, near the shadows of the arched doorways, a hunched figure watched. Old Man Park stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the man at the podium. He had seen the truth, but in a world built on power, truth was merely a whisper in a hurricane. He clutched his bottle, turned, and shuffled out into the cold morning light, disappearing into the city that had long ago consumed them all. As the ceremony concluded, the room fell into a tense, expectant silence. The throne was empty. The Han name, which had defined the underworld for 3 decades, had effectively ceased to exist. Jin-tae descended from the podium. He did not rush. He walked through the aisles, stopping to place a steadying hand on the shoulders of the lieutenants who had once reported to the boy. One by one, they looked up at him, not with suspicion, but with the hollow, desperate need for leadership. He stopped at the head of the table where Minwoo had sat, and then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he pulled out the chair. He sat down. The room exhaled. The tension of the last few days broke, replaced by the collective relief of a structure that had found its new axis. There was no resistance. There was only the sound of 100 men shifting their weight, signaling their silent, pragmatic acceptance of the new order. Jin-tae looked out over the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the men who would now call him boss. He felt no triumph, no surge of adrenaline. There was only the cold, quiet satisfaction of a long-term investment finally yielding its dividend. He had waited 10 years, through the seasons of a life, to arrive at this chair. The king was dead. The long game was over. Seo Jin-tae picked up a fountain pen, opened the ledger, and began to write.